Hey everyone, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. I'm Greg Nettle, and I have the absolute privilege and joy of serving as president of Stadia Church Planting, where our vision is for every child on the planet to have a church. We do that by helping you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. This episode of the Church Planting Podcast is very near and dear to my heart. I have one of my closest friends in life, Dr. Tim Harlow, on this podcast. Tim Harlow served as the senior pastor of Parkview Christian Church from 1990 until his recent transition from that ministry into his next stage just in November of 2023. During that time, the church grew from about 150 people to more than 10,000 people who called Parkview home and attended at multi-site campuses every weekend. Tim shares in this podcast episode amazing leadership lessons along the way and things he wishes he would have learned earlier. Incredible insights for church planters, for church leaders, for business leaders as well. So welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. I am really thrilled today to have on this very special episode my colleague, but more importantly, absolutely one of my closest friends in life and ministry for a lot of years. Welcome, Tim Harlow, to the Church Planting Podcast.
It's good to see you, buddy. You look better than ever.
You too, friend. Just to give to our listeners just a little bit of background, you and I have shared 20 plus. We started our churches about the same time. We kind of grew up together in ministry with all the pains, the joys, the sorrows, the celebrations that, go along with that. And so give us just a bit, when did you start? You just finished up this phase of ministry and what you're heading into next. Give us a bit of context.
Yeah. January of 1990, I got called to this church in Chicago. And for you church planters, I will always be jealous. I know that it's really hard and I haven't done it. So I'm not telling you that it's easier than what I did, but I went to a church with 150 people that was 40 years old and conflicted in every way. And it was about a 10-year, very painful journey to the point where, it was almost, turnaround churches killing, McManus, I think, says it, killing one church and birthing another. So it was about a 10-year period of doing that. We got the people all going in the right direction, 10 years in and relocated. And I think God recognized that I don't think the relocation was nearly as big a deal as the leadership that we had trained and that had risen up, that was united in the vision for the one outside. And God, I just felt like God just lifted the lid off and our hair was on fire for really the rest of the journey. We did 600 to 6,000 in 10 years. And went on from there. We did multi-site. We're in the south suburbs of Chicago, Parkview Christian Church. And so that was the journey. Yeah. Ironically, you and I were at a Willow Summit when you and I decided to start thinking. It's ironic if you think about it. Started thinking about how we could stay together in ministry about 20 years ago. And we've been doing this ever since. And I would say that's one of the most important decisions I ever made.
Isn't that crazy when we look at what has sustained us for the long haul? It was saying we're going to do life together and we're committed to this. We actually signed a covenant together with two other leaders as well. And to this day, I have the text stream on my phone right now. I don't think a day goes by where we're not in the four of us texting each other and saying, hey, here's what's going on. Could you pray for this? And so on. Tim, give us a snapshot. So when you finished up at Parkview, literally just a few months ago, how many campuses did you have? I think you were somewhere around 15,000 in attendance. Something
No, we were at 9,000 when before COVID hit, and then we weren't back from there yet. We were probably still at 6 when I walked away 6 months ago. 3 campuses, same thing that everybody kind of did. At the time you thought you just needed to build a big building with a 2,000 seat auditorium and fill it up. And then we did that. And then all of a sudden, the multi-site thing was catching on. So we did add 2 more sites. We were just getting ready to launch our fourth site when COVID hit, and it hit us hard in Chicago. Our governor wasn't exactly the best at managing that.
Okay, so you've done so much over the years, and we've walked that journey together. And one of my favorite things to do is to talk to leaders who have done that journey and ask you to talk to leaders who are just starting that journey. Maybe leaders who are just getting ready to launch their new church or do a turnaround church. You've been involved in church. I mean, Parkview has partnered with Stadia over the years and planted, I don't know, hundreds of churches. If we'd actually figure it out, you were one of the first in Passion Stadia partnership. I think you were the first in Ecuador, which
That's right.
which resulted in more than 200 new churches being planted in South America. So you guys have been extremely involved in the multiplication movement as well, which I so appreciate it because it's not been about your own kingdom. It's been about God's kingdom. So, I want people to hear that. So let's talk about some kind of learnings you have along the way or things that, you wish you would have known back then that people would have, maybe help them on this journey today.
I think as I'm explaining this whole thing, I think back and I think, should I have even gone there in the first place? And I want to say, I've said this over and over again. It was the call of God. I wasn't from Chicago. Denise and I, we went to a place that was 70% Catholic. Okay. 70% of the people grew up Catholic. And some of you people are going to be planting in places like that. My joke is I grew up in Oklahoma. I thought the Hail Mary was a football play, right? I mean, I did not know how to do Catholic ministry, but it was, and hear me on this, the call of God. It was a release from God when it was time to go, and it was a call of God when I went there. And don't mistake that for I didn't try to leave a few times along the way. And don't mistake 33 years at the same place as, well, if I just stay there, it's gonna all work out, because you don't know where those things are. But following the call of God, my wife and I, we went back to the motel that night after the interview, and we just wept. And it was because we knew this is what God wanted. And I think in our hearts, we also knew this was not going to be easy. This is a mission field. South suburbs of Chicago do not have much evangelical movement going on at all. We were the largest evangelical church for about 4 million people down in that area. When we left, I mean, still are. So we knew it was going to be hard.
Yeah, it's just so important, and I agree with that. We've talked about that a great deal. Tim, talk about lots of our church planters right now and our thriving churches are doing the team ministry with their spouse. And I know you and Denise work so closely together over the years. What are some things you've learned about marriage and ministry and ministering together?
It's tricky, as you well know. It's tricky and it's beautiful. And we did it for 20 years. She was our worship programming director. I begged her to our worship was so terrible, and, we needed so much help. I begged her. She had 3 small kids at home, and she did it, temporarily for 20 years. And by the time she was done, she was overseeing 11 staff. So, we got help. We did one of the times at the Blessing Ranch, and I am, if you're not familiar with the Blessing Ranch, you should be. Counseling for pastors. One of the many times we went was about this issue completely. It is very complex. For us, the key was having a great executive pastor that was in the middle of it all, that could speak into both of our lives to a certain degree. I mean, Bill wasn't going to tell Denise too much, but he could kind of help us when things were tricky. And I wish I would have listened to her better than I did. But it was a beautiful thing. And honestly, one of the harder things about walking away, because we walked away from Chicago, we're in Nashville now with our grandkids, and doing ministry together was always such an important thing to us. And here we are starting over.
And I would say the same thing. Julie and I look back on the years we served together at River Tree in very similar capacities as you and Denise. And we look at that as one of the best times of our life together. And so,
Hmm.
I know a lot of people that maybe they're not hot on the idea, but man, I think you're hearing from both of us that it was a really good thing. Tim, the other thing that you're one of the best communicators that I've ever sat under, ever listened to. Tremendous preacher of the gospel. I mean that.
Thank you.
And we wrote a lot of sermons together over the years,
Uh,
ideas. Um, talk to us a little bit about, sermon prep. How important is preaching in the new church, in church, reaching people? Just give us some tips on that.
Preaching was the pivotal thing in the early years. And don't let me minimize, prayer and discipleship and everything else. But in the early years, when I was turning things around, even though I was still green in my preaching, um, the people that didn't like what was going on at the church would still come in and go, well, that was a good sermon. They couldn't argue with the fact that what I was giving from the meat that I was giving from the pulpit was good, and that more people were coming. Now, at some point, they started complaining because there were too many new people coming.
Right.
You know how all that goes. But I think preaching is preeminent in the deal. For me, communication was about gathering sources and putting things together and putting my own spin on it. And my spin was a lot of humor. But I got something from Brian Tome, your friend and mine, early on, and he said his goal in preaching was the beer factor. He said he wanted the guys when they were sitting down listening to him, he wanted them within 3 or 5 minutes, I can't remember what he said, to think to themselves, I wouldn't mind having a beer with that guy. So for me, the focus was a lot on how can I connect with the guys, because you know what, I mean, the women are they're an easier target, right? They're going to listen. They read more. We understand them. So a big part of it was how can I connect with the guys? And so I used a lot of humor because that's just my personality. And I have ADHD. So I kept it moving and I kept it fun. And I had to, stay awake while I was standing up there. So, I made that happen.
Okay, so Tim, one of the things I've so appreciated about you is, as we worked together, I mean, we were combining stuff, and I think one of the things that I watched today with some of our young church planters and even church leaders is the almost an unwillingness to share stuff. How important is it? Like, I just think of all the stuff you and I and Ben and Titcheris and Eddie Lowen and Gene Apple, and I mean, we could list a dozen preachers
Right.
that we shared over the years. And talk about that a bit and why it's important to collaborate.
It's so important, and I don't understand that concept. And I know that, I get the plagiarism thing and I get all that, but I think in the new age of AI, who knows how this whole thing is going to work. But when I talk about those early years and I was delivering good sermons, a lot of them were Bob Russell's sermons from
Yeah.
Southeast Christian. I mean, I didn't, I took a hermeneutics class, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And especially if it got to a tricky topic, it did so much for me to be able to listen to a Bob Russell sermon on a cassette tape and go, hey, this is what he said. So I can tell you that. And sometimes I told people where I got it. Sometimes they didn't care.
Yeah, and I think the plagiarism factor is really important. We have to be careful of that. So I would always say, hey, I was writing this sermon with Tim Harlow, and so this comes from there, or Gene Apple says this about this, or I listened to this sermon by John Ortberg, and and
Absolutely.
so a lot of. But in those early days, especially when there's this million things going on, as much as we can get help from others, I mean, we do it in other areas of, hey, how do you do discipleship? How do you do,
Yeah.
the systems and processes of small groups and different things? And I think we need to lean into that with some of our preaching as well.
That's a
Tim,
great
talk
point.
about vision casting, arguably the most important thing for launching and sustaining a church. And yet you and I, prior to coming on this podcast, we're talking about how little we actually are experiencing it now in established
Yeah.
churches.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, if you ask anybody in our congregation at any point during the 33 years, what is our model? Who are we going after? It was always the prodigal. It was always the prodigal son. I would preach from that passage, once a year, probably. And part of it was because, and again, in my culture, 70% came from a Catholic background. So it's fun to be able to talk about the older brother because that's what they had experienced in a lot of ways. That was their church culture. And then for me, growing up as a pastor's kid in Oklahoma, I could talk about the older brother legalism stuff also. And we could talk about all that. It was fun, but the idea was always about the one on the outside. And that has to be white hot from the pulpit. That has to be white hot from me. And it's not just this is what you should do. It also has to be modeled. They need to know that you've got those people in your life. I mean, I've told my biker Mike story so many times that I think people might think he was the only, non-Christian guy I was ever around, but they have to be able to know, they have to be able to see that your neighbors are coming to Christ, that they're with you, that your people that are around, and your staff, your people might not always know that, but your staff knows that. And then your staff emulates that as things get bigger. And then, it goes from there, but that's so important.
Well, and Jane, in our conversation before the podcast started, you were telling me about one of your neighbors who needs Jesus right now. And I love the fact that you know that one of your neighbors needs Jesus.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's just a reflection of that. And so, Tim, as the church, grows and like how do you cast this vision? Because there is a natural tendency, and I get it sociologically, for people to say, wait, we kind of like the 200 people we know here. Or then it gets bigger and it's kind of, we've gone to 2 services and we say, well, we kind of know all the people at this service. How do you keep that multiplication factor and so forth to say, hey, our job, and well, wait, why should we plant new churches? We're doing it right here in Chicago. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say the hardest capital campaign out of the 5 that we did was the last one, when it was to raise money for another campus, because most of the people that I was trying to raise the generosity awareness from weren't going to go, and they weren't going to care. So it was that constant vision of, even for me at that point, it's like, well, my grandkids aren't going to go to that campus, but yours might, and somebody else's might. And that's why we're out of space. We can't do this anymore. We have to be able to cast a vision for the people on the outside over and over and over again. And it's about eternity. It's about, I mean, it's a value that has to be taught in you. If you're the leader and you're comfortable, then your people are going to be comfortable. So, I mean, and that's okay. I mean, I guess if that's what God's called you to do is to do that kind of a church, that I mean, it's not okay with me, but
Our listeners
I'm not
aren't
going to judge.
That's why they're listening to this. It's
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
like I said, when you guys, you went with me to Ecuador at the beginning of my presidency of Stadia, and I remember at the end, I mean, you were almost in tears, and you were like, "We'll be first." You raised your hand, and said, "Play it here," which resulted in so much more. I know you've had heavy involvement in Africa and different places where you're multiplying. Okay, you mentioned capital campaigns. What do you know now about finances that you'd go, hey, make sure you do this to younger leaders?
Well, honestly, that would be it. If there was a part of me that, I mean, and I walked away. I'm 62. I walked away at 62, which some people would consider young. I would like to encourage the world to think about pastors doing that more likely than they do it later, because the later you are, the more burned out you are, and you're not going to have the energy for what's going on. But if I had a burnout factor, I mean, obviously we've gone through COVID and everything else along the way. It was probably around the generosity needle. And again, for me, I'm talking to 70% of the people that grew up in a Catholic church. So if you're talking to people who grew up Baptist or even grew up in a, or Christian or whatever, or grew up in a churchy kind of environment, then you talk about generosity in a different way. But if you're talking to somebody, who just never understood any of the principles of tithing or whatever, it's pulling it out, and holding up the value of generosity. And I could have done a better job of that. And I should have done a better job than that. And I can already see that Ted, the guy who took over for me, he has more energy for it, and he's leaning into it, because it's after every capital campaign, I would say I would do that again if I didn't need more money, because the spiritual growth of the congregation. It's not about money. It's about where your treasure is, your heart will be. But it's so easy to get into the place where you're like, well, I don't want to talk about that. It makes me uncomfortable because people think I'm just trying to get myself more money. You got to get over that and figure out how to make that happen and talk about it.
Okay, so we've talked about that. So there is, and I remember when I went through that shift in my ministry as well, because I started out going, I don't want to talk about money because people, all they think is the church wants money. But the reality, when you get to the shift of saying, hey, this is about discipleship. This is not about me getting your money. This is about you becoming a better follower of Jesus. Now it's a game changer, because now I want to talk about money. It's one of my favorite things to talk about because it controls so much of our lives. And I can't be a follower of Jesus unless I'm following biblical principles on finances.
Yeah, no. And it was Jesus' favorite topic too, by the way. So, I mean, that's kind of the point, right? It's just hard. It's just hard to keep going back and forth and back and forth. And here we go again. And, blah, blah, blah. You got to get past it. You've got to embrace it. It is a discipleship issue.
Okay, Tim, so let's talk about personal health. I mean, there's a lot being talked about that these days, which is a good thing, because we're watching, again, pastors, leaders, young and old, flame out on a regular basis. You and I, we were just texting back and forth a couple weeks ago. It just heartbroken about, some leaders we heard about who had been involved in an extramarital affair and different things. And what have been some of the things? I mean, again, you and I have shared, we know the good, the bad, the ugly. We just do about each other.
Yeah, I know.
So talk about that. Talk about some of the things that you'd recommend to stay healthy for the long haul.
I hit a burnout, and I think that's the first time we ever met, was on that float trip that we did.
Wasn't that crazy? I've told people about that. We did a whitewater rafting trip, and that's where I met through Stadia. That was 20 years ago.
Yeah, I know. It's insane. And what's really the God story of that is that I had burnout like 2 weeks before that, out of the blue. It was after we relocated. I was working on a dissertation. My hair was on fire. I was feeling great. And all of a sudden it was one of those, that you hear about. It was Elijah, going into the cave saying, I'm here all by myself. And God's providence, Larry Winger had brought us together, and we went and did that thing. And Dr. John was there.
I forgot about that. Dr. John.
Yeah, that's where I met John Walker too. So, so from there, Denise and I did go to the Blessing Ranch. I went to the Blessing Ranch many times. What I would say about personal health is, use all of the resources that you can. Go to counseling, get some good friends around you, and be committed to each other. And there's nothing wrong if those are in your church or whatever. You need those, but you probably also need some peers who are, that was just so amazing about Ben and Eddie and you and me is, we were all in the same kinds of, we had the same hobbies and, all those kinds of things, same size churches and all that. You need those kinds of people. Obviously the spiritual disciplines, I guess I could throw that in there because, it ought to be obvious, but it absolutely matters. You were a great model for that for me in the early years, and getting those people around you, taking a day off, was something, even though we had Saturday services since 2020, since 2000, I'm sorry. Since 2000, I did 23 years of Saturday night services, and don't ask me whether it was right or not. I don't know, but I had a day off, and I took my day off, and I did that. The priority on the marriage, over and over again, whatever money it costs, whatever things. I mean, we're at 40 years now, and I just told a group of people yesterday, do you know how many people do you know that have joy in their life and peace and contentment and a 40-year marriage and kids who love them and money in the bank? I said, well, I'm one of them. And I'm not going to tell you, look at me. I'm just going to say the narrow road is the right road. Okay. Broad leads to destruction. And, that's what I'm saying. So, what I didn't realize.
Talk to me about physical health, because you've been an example to me too. Like, you keep yourself in shape.
I do. I work out, almost every day. And I started that, not at the beginning, but probably it's been 35 years that I've really been purposeful about it. And I eat well-ish, and I try not to drink too much, and I am doing supplement things that help me and all those kinds of things. But the personal health thing is something, as you get older, you realize how important it is more and more. And now the research around it is unbelievable. I mean, leg strength tied to longevity and grip strength and stuff that now they know all this stuff, and all you got to do is be open to it. And so, the physical health, the sleep, wasn't always one of the easiest things for me to do, but that's a spiritual discipline, man, all those things.
Tim, you have been an example to me personally, a great friend, and to all of us. Thank you for that. Now, any last thing that you'd say to a younger leader that we haven't covered here to go, I just want to say this to you.
Leadership. In the early years, what I said about God lifting the lid off of Parkview was when we had the right leadership in place. As COVID hit, 30 years into my ministry, we had the right leadership in place, but we didn't have all the swim lanes lined up the right way. We didn't have our bylaws and everything going in the right direction, because we were all just good friends at that point. I would say, get the people around you that have the vision, and get some help to make sure that everybody stays in the place where they're supposed to be. And you share the leadership, you share the Holy Spirit, as Moses did with the 70 elders. You share all of that. It works out really, really well. But don't think that just because you're already there, you don't need to continue to have help from the outside, have help developing the things. And as you're going through these different phases, everything changes every time. It goes from everybody knowing everything to having to be a staff-led scenario to the point where you can't have lay people getting involved in the nuts and bolts because they don't know what's going on. So I would say leadership mostly is about leadership that has the same vision. Mostly it's about whoever it is. Even if it's just you and your staff, you better make sure that your staff are on board with you. You start finding somebody that says, well, we're not about the one that's out there. That's probably the time to start deciding whether they're the right fit.
Well, friends, you can see why Tim is one of the people I love and respect most in life. Tim, thanks for being on the Church Planting Podcast.
I love you, bud. I'm proud of what you're doing.
Thanks for listening to the Church Planting Podcast, part of the Stadia Podcast Network. To find more great episodes and to see how Stadia can help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation, be sure to check out stadia.org/podcasts.